Welcome back. In this video, we will take an AWS scenario where we will learn about the Aurora database and a multi-AZ deployment using an Aurora database. So let's take this scenario. We have an e-commerce application that uses an Amazon Aurora multi-AZ deployment for its database. While analyzing the performance metrics, the engineering team has found that the database reads are causing high input-output and adding latency to the write request against the database. As an AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate, what would you recommend to separate the read request from the write request? Well, we set up a read replica and modify the application to use the appropriate endpoint. An Amazon Aurora database cluster consists of one or more database instances and a cluster volume that manages the data for those database instances. An Aurora cluster volume is a virtual database storage volume that spans multiple availability zones, with each availability zone having a copy of the database cluster data. And we have two types of database instances that make up the Aurora database cluster: the primary database instance and the Aurora replica. The primary instance supports read and write operations and performs all of the data modifications to the cluster volume. Each Aurora database cluster has one primary database instance. Aurora replica connects to the same storage volume as the primary instance and supports only read operation. Each Aurora database cluster can have up to 15 replicas in addition to the primary instance. Aurora automatically fails over to an Aurora replica in case the primary instance becomes unavailable, and you can specify the failover priority for Aurora database replicas. Aurora replicas can also offload read workload from the primary database instance. The Aurora replicas have two main purposes. You can issue queries to them to scale the read operations for your application, and you also can typically do so by connecting to the reader endpoint of the cluster. That way, the Aurora can spread the workload or the load for read-only connections across as many replicas as you have in your cluster. Aurora replicas also help to increase availability. While setting up a multi-AZ deployment for Aurora, you create an Aurora replica or reader node in a different availability zone. You use the reader endpoint for read-only connections for your Aurora cluster. This endpoint uses a load balancing mechanism to help your cluster handle a query-intensive workload. The reader endpoint is the endpoint that you can supply to applications that do reporting or other read-only operations on the cluster. The reader endpoint load balances connections to available replicas in an Aurora cluster. Note that Aurora database does not have a standby instance. Standby is only something created with RDS databases and not with Aurora databases. Aurora does not have built-in support for read-through caching. To implement caching, you will need to integrate something like ElastiCache, and that would need code changes for the application. This is another schema that explains the primary instance and the replica. They share a common cluster volume, as we see in the gray box at the bottom. That was all on Aurora and the database instances and the read replicas that it supports in multi-AZ deployment. I hope you like it and see you at the next video.